Today I'm recording how to do the drag and drop in HTML5 and JavaScript. The end result of what we will make with this example is we have a list of first names and a list of last names. And then I have these text boxes below with full names waiting to be filled in. I will drag any combination of first name and last name into these text boxes and they will be copied. Once a full name has been done, if I try to drag some other content into the same text box, I disallow the pasting of that. Besides, you will note I have a single space between the first and last names. So I could make several combinations. Mary Smith. That was items being copied. Then I'll show you how to move the contents of items in a drag and drop operation. In the same example, if I drag a name, it goes away from the list of first names available. You're starting with a clean slate in a folder called drag and drop. I'll make an HTML file, call it index.html. In the body, I will have three parts. One to explain what I'm trying to do. A name parts section that has the first name and second names. And there'll be a full names section that has the full name text boxes. In the about section, I'll just add a paragraph with a title. In the name parts section, I want to have two list boxes. And each of these divs will have a list with a few first names and last names respectively. So let me copy this bit. And finally, I want a few text boxes here. And I want these text boxes to appear in two columns. Okay, we have all the content. Let's add some CSS called index.css. The file doesn't exist, so I'll create it. The font size for the entire document to have a base size of 10 pixels, and then any other font size I will declare in the units rem, which are relative to the root document's font size. Next, I want to set the background for the body element and the HTML element. I'll just randomly set some background color. That's good enough for me. And anything that's a header, I want it to have a font size of. I want the font for the entire body to be at least 20 pixels. That's 2 rems. And I want the fonts for the headers to be 3 rems. Okay. I want to align or set these two first names and last names side by side, adjacent to each other rather than after each other. So I will make the container that has both of these as a flex box, and their container is the name parts section. So I'll make the name parts section a flex box. The default direction will be row, that is, they'll come after each other. But if I don't add any space between them, they'll stick to each other. So let me add some space between them. I do that by justify content, put space around it. There you are. So just for the body, I want a padding of, say, 15 pixels everywhere on all the four sides. Okay. Next, I want these text boxes to come in two columns. The first one has 10 text boxes and the second one has 10 text boxes. And I also want to increase the font size and the width and the general look and feel of the text boxes. So let me identify the text boxes. Okay, they have a unique ID each, but I want to apply it for all of them. So I could either add a class for each of them, or I could identify them by their path in the DOM. So I could just say any text box that's inside, or any text box that's of type, any input that's of type text and starts with full name. Let's do that. For that, we need to use something called CSS attribute selectors. Please study those if you don't know what that means. So I will use an attribute selector. I'll say type equals text, and another attribute that the element I'm trying to select is called ID, and it starts with, I'm looking for the caret sign. It starts with the text full name as a prefix. So any element that has an attribute named type, which has the value text exactly, and the element also has an ID that starts with full name, that'll select all of these text boxes. So I want to say for them, please have a font size. Everything in the body of the document has a font size of 2. So let's see how they look with the exact same font size that each of this text has. Okay, they're slightly bigger and a little better. Now I want to add some margin to each of them. And so I will add, say, 10 pixels on above each text box and below each text box. And let's just say 10 pixels, or let's just say 8 pixels above and below each text box, and 10 pixels around each text box horizontally. Okay, that's slightly better. So when I drop something into a text box, I don't by mistake drop it into a text box I didn't intend to drop it into if they're close to each other. Now they look horrible, so let's go to these columns and actually make them appear as columns. So the thing that contains these columns is called full names container. I'll make a flex box out of this. Please study flex box. And the default direction will be row. And once again, if I don't add any space between them, this is how they look. And that's fine. I'm fine with not having space between them. Now, I wanted them in 2 columns. And you might be thinking, what is this? These are 6 columns. That's because a text box or an input control by default does not display as a block element. A block element is something which when you display, and if you write anything after the block element, that appears in the next line. An input element is not a block element. So if you have an input element So if you have an input element and you put anything after that, it appears in the same line. And so the next input element, full name 02, appears in the same line if there is space available in the same line. So really this is text box 1, this is text box 2, and that's column 1. This is text box 3, this is text box 4, this is text box 5, and so on. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and the second column starts 11, 12, 13, 14, and so on. So if you were viewing this on a smaller device, say a mobile phone like this is how it would appear. Now there would be 2 columns because there's not enough available width. So I'll leave it like this. Responsive design is another topic you want to study, but we're not really doing anything towards responsive design right now, except that this flex box takes care of a lot of width issues. Now I want to remove these dots that appear in front of these list items. To do that, I'll go to the UL that contains each of these. There are 2 ULs, unordered lists. I will give each of them an ID. I'll just say UL first names. This is UL first names, and this is UL last names. I will write a rule set. For each of their IDs, when you put a comma between 2 selectors, the rule applies to both this as well as this. I want to say for any of these 2 lists, there is a list style type property. I want to set it to none so that these disks, these round thingies, they disappear. That's much better. And I want some space between each of them, so when I drag them I have enough space. So for each of the list items in any of these lists, so I'll select this. Any list item that's inside this or inside this, I want the line height, or I could just set the line height on these itself. And the children will inherit that line height. I want this has a text size of 20 pixels. This inherits the text size from the body element. As you can see, if you look at the style editor, or if you just look at the inspector, if you look at the inspector and select any one of these, this has a font size of 2 rem, that is 2 times the root element's font size, so 20 pixels. And it gets it because it is inheriting the font size from the body element and the HTML element. And so the default height is already 2 rems. So if I set the default line height to 2 rems, it'll be exactly as it is now, or even slightly a little squeezed up. So I wanted to set it to something more than 2 rems. Let me add one more line. And if I refresh the page now it's slightly better. Also, when I hover over each of these items, I want their mouse cursor to change. What I'm writing here is a combination of something called CSS combinators. You want to study something called CSS combinators and pseudo classes. So what I'm trying to say is, if there is a list item, li element inside of this one, when I hover over it, this should happen. Similarly, if there's a list item inside of this one, this list, when I hover over it, this should happen. What should happen is the cursor should change to a pointer. This is not necessary, but I just want it for the visual effect. And when I come here, it changes to a pointer. So when I drag it, it'll look like something. That's enough of beautification. Not really beautification, but enough of arranging things. Let's get to the actual meat and potatoes, which is the JavaScript code. For that, I'll add jQuery. It's not necessary that you add jQuery, but I'll add it just for the convenience of selecting items. It's easier to select items. A Visual Studio shortcut defined, a user snippet defined. If you want to learn how to write user snippets in Visual Studio, please watch this video of mine. So I'll write a custom script. I've got another snippet defined for adding a script element. I'll click this. It doesn't exist, so I'll create the file. Now, at the basis of any drag and drop operation are two events. The first one is called drag start, and the second one is called drop. There are other events in the API, but I don't want to talk about them because they're not as relevant. This is the crux, the essence of how you do it. The drag start event happens when you start dragging an item. If you want something to happen then, you need to write an event handler for the drag start event. Now, if we don't write any code at all, look at the behavior. Nothing happens. Nothing really happens. There's no visual change, and there's no actual change inside the memory of the browser process. However, before processing these events, there is a need to tell the browser engine that I want this item to be draggable, so that it does a little bit of its own handling to make the visual appearance of the item change as we drag it. To do that, we add an attribute to any element that we want to make draggable, and that attribute is called draggable. So I'll go into the HTML and add, since I want each of these names to be draggable, I want to add an attribute to each of these LIs. And the way to do that is to set the draggable attribute true on each of these. Now, I could do that over here, but I'm feeling a bit lazy and I don't want to do it here. So I'll just do it in JavaScript. The first thing I'll write is, I'll write a function saying add draggable attribute to draggable items, to name part list items. Okay, this function, as its name suggests, will add that attribute to each element. If I just add that to one element and show you how it changes in visual appearance, let me just add that to one element, John. And now if I drag John, okay, in Firefox, you note nothing happens. But if I open the same thing in Chrome, because I've added something to John, I've added the attribute to John, when I drag it, I can see the contents John. What I also see on top of that, a circle with a cross, indicates that you can't drop this item here right now, wherever you are. If I take it into the text box, it says you still can't drop it here. You basically can't drop it anywhere right now. So the drop target, unless each element that wants to be a drop target tells the browser that, okay, it's okay to drop this on me, the browser will show this icon. Every other browser will show this. But if I do this to Mary, nothing happens right now, because we haven't added that attribute to Mary. So I'll add it to each and every one. Now it's only in Firefox that if you simply add the draggable item, the draggable attribute, no visual change is made. Every other browser will show a visual drag image. That image that you were seeing of the text John, that's called the drag image of an item. Now, in Firefox only, the drag image doesn't show unless you also write the drag start event handler and you also write some code in it. If you want to know what the quirks of this Firefox browser are with regards to this visual representation of a drag image, watch this video of mine. Anyway, going back to the topic, let's add in the JavaScript, let's add a draggable attribute to each of these. Now, to identify these, I'll just say any list item inside this list. UL first names. So UL first names li or UL last names li. And this has to have a pound sign or a hash sign because these are IDs. That's the selector. For any of these children, please add the attribute draggable and set its value to true. That's how easy it is. Now if I refresh the page, I'm sorry, this is Firefox, so you're not going to see any visual representation in Firefox yet. Let's do it in another browser. I see John being dragged, Mary being dragged, Peter, Chris, David, Smith, Doe. Wonderful. All these items display a drag image. The same thing would happen in other browsers. Now I need to add the drag start event handler for each of these LIs. So let me cache this so that I don't have to specify this and search for these items again. Say li. Okay. The next thing I want to do is add the drag start event for each of these. So I'll say li dot on drag start and I'll give it a name parts list item drag start event handler. Each event handler receives an event object, which is a custom, either a custom DOM event object or the plain old vanilla event object from DOM. Or if you're using jQuery, as in this case we are, jQuery will sometimes wrap the event it received from the DOM into a new jQuery event. And in this case also it'll do that. So anyway, so this is the drag start event handler. All we have to do in this is there is a property called data transfer inside the event object. If we were not using jQuery and we were using plain old JavaScript, there would be an event object that would have been thrown by the DOM, the browser engine, directly to us without jQuery sitting in between us, and that would have a property called data transfer, and then that would have a method called set data. What we're essentially trying to do is when the user starts dragging an item, we want this name to be copied somewhere in the memory so that we can then pick up the name when he drops it on this element and then copy that name into the value of this text box. So we set the data. There are two arguments to the set data function. The first is what kind of data do you want to set? A text or a bookmark or an image, or what is it exactly? I say I want to set some text, and the value I want to set is, what's the value I want to set? Whatever is the value of this thing that's being dragged. The thing that's being dragged usually is in the event.target, but you can also access it with a this. This inside the event handler refers to the plain old JavaScript DOM element that's being dragged. And if I want to get a jQuery object out of it and use its text property, since it's a div or a li, I'll use the text property to get the inner text of that. Now, this event, if this were a plain event, it would have this data transfer object. But a jQuery event doesn't have. What jQuery does is it takes the DOM event that the browser sends us, it sits in between, it wraps that into an event of its own, and it preserves the original event into a property called original event. So I'll really have to write event.originalEvent.data transfer. And if I want to remove jQuery at any time and I still want this function to work, then I want to insulate that from this. So I could say event.originalEvent or just event. So if there is an event.originalEvent property, then use that please. Otherwise this will be undefined. The original event will be undefined and just the event property will be used. That makes this code work for both plain old JavaScript as well as jQuery. Now this should get the text, and the next event I want to write is on each of these text boxes. I want to write the drop event. The drop event occurs as soon as the item is dropped on a drop target. These are drop targets. So I will say for each of these text boxes, I don't have a selection here for the text boxes. The text boxes are, I could use the same selector I used over here for these text boxes, which is, I'll write it here again, I'll cache that. I'll say all these input items can be accessed with the selector input element that has an attribute called text. I will escape the string, and also an attribute called ID that starts with $symbol = starts with the value full name. I'll escape this string as well, and that's my selector. That selects all the text boxes, and I want to add, for each of those text boxes, I want to add a drop event handler. So full name text box drop event handler. I'll write that. Once again, we get a jQuery event that wraps the original event. So I want to say event dot. What I want to do here is just get whatever data was set in this data transfer object. Just like there's a set data function, there's going to be a get data function. So I want to get that data first, either event.originalEvent or just the event object. From that, please get the data transfer property, and please get the data from that is of type text, and please store it in a variable called data. And this data, obviously for me logically, is the name part that is being dragged. At the very least, all I want to do is set the text of, or set the value of whatever input is being dragged. The current element is this, and the jQuery object for that element is $this. I want to set its value, because it's a text box, to the name part. That's basically it. Not quite, but we're getting there. Let's do this much and see. Now Firefox, since we've already got the event for the drag start event handler, and we've got the data transfer set data written, Firefox will also display the visual aid. And plus, we've already got the drop event handler, so all browsers will now also do the drop operation. I drag John and I put it here. Sorry. Why does it appear twice? Well, let's debug that. So you see, the thing is, we've got one time the name that was dragged, and we're setting it to the value of the text box. And if you see the inspector, after running this line of code, I break here and I look at the inspector, and I inspect this text box, it will have the text just once. It will have the value just once. Well, it's not showing it here, but it has the value correctly only once. But then there's also a default event handler that every browser has for the drop event. If I didn't have this code written, if I hadn't written this code at all, let's just comment this script tag. Or let me not comment it. Let me just comment out the line that attaches the drop event handler. So I don't have a drop event handler. I do have a drag event handler. Every browser by default, when you drag an item, it automatically lets text boxes allow dropping contents on them if the content is a text. So this is without our drop handler working. Our drop handler is disabled. If I look at the code, I do not have a drop handler. I've commented that portion out, and still every browser will allow the text to be dropped. So you might say, then why the hell are we writing a drop handler? Let's just leave it at this. The thing is, the default behavior that every browser will allow is it'll just take the text. First of all, the default behavior every browser will allow is completely different and radically different. So one of the most effective ways of going insane is to try and make a piece of code work exactly the same on all browsers. And this is one of the instances of those methods of going insane. So if you look at this is Firefox, if I drag and drop events and drop text contents, it concatenates them but without spaces. One thing is we want spaces in between. The next thing is it just lets me concatenate any amount of names. I want to stop that as well. The third thing is if I look at Chrome and execute the same code, which doesn't have a drop event and has only a drag event, if I drag something, it lets me drop it. And if I drag something else, hang on a sec. Is it running the same code? Yes. Yes, see, if I drag it and drop another piece of text, it won't let me drop another piece of text. Once you've dropped something, if the text box already had text, Chrome doesn't let you drop anything else. So every browser does it very differently. Every browser has implemented this API completely differently. And right now we are only doing two simple events, which is drag, start, and drop. And I've even disabled the drop event, and you can still see differences. Actually, if you implement the full-blown HTML drag and drop API, as I did, I saw there were so many differences across browsers. It's easy to land up completely insane if you try and make even a small text box participating in a drag drop behave consistently across all these browsers. From the visual changes, the visual drag images, to just the visual display of what's happening when you enter a drop target, there are hundreds of differences across browsers. So point I'm trying to say is we need to prevent the browser's default behavior from happening when we finish a drop operation. And to do that, we go into the event handler for the drop event, and at the end we say either event.prevent default or just return false from the event handler. Both of these do the exact same thing. They prevent the event, that is the default event handler that's in the browser, from executing. So now when we refresh this page in Firefox and I try the same operation again, we see that the text is copied just once. Now I need to make sure that the text does not concatenate without spaces, and that's the easy part. I would let you do it, but let's just do it anyway quickly. So when I get the name part, I want to check the existing text in the text box, in the full name text box, will be gotten by this.val. If existing text is not, or if is already if it's nothing, then copy and paste everything, which is the name part, in make the value of this guy the name part. Otherwise, if it already has some text, then make the value the existing text plus a space plus the name part. That should do it. Okay, now it should work. Okay, and now I can still copy other stuff and it'll keep adding to that. And I'll leave you to write the code that prevents a user from doing that. That should be pretty simple. That should be just over here. Basically, what you want to do once the thing is dropped is completely up to you. Before we implement the move operation, let me tell you that I'm starting an online course for people who want to learn how to program a computer but are complete novices right now. This will be an online course. I haven't disclosed or launched the details yet, but if you go to my website, and you will receive an email if you sign up for the mailing list when I launch the course. To sign up for the mailing list, go to the top of the page, click this mailing list link, or you can just scroll down to the bottom and fill your details here and click the join button, and I'll send you an email when the course is done. It's for people who are complete novices. Maybe you're a hairstylist, maybe you're a mechanical engineer, maybe you're fresh out of college, you've done your computer science degree but you don't understand quite well how programming works. Maybe you're already someone working in the IT industry with 2-3 years, 4 years experience. You want help, you're struggling, you don't know what's going on. Then I can help you, and that's the course you want to join. So just sign up for the mailing list, please. Okay, let's get to the rest of the code. Now, if I want to make this item movable, all I have to do is, one silly thing is I'll change the header to say this is a move example. And the second thing is, in the drop event, all I have to do is remove that item that was being dragged. To remove the item that was being dragged, the item that was being dragged was one of the LIs. I need the ID of the LI. So let's go to the HTML and see if we've got IDs for the LIs. We don't have any IDs for these LIs. The other way to identify these LIs, the LI that's being dragged, would be to get the index of the item that's being dragged. So instead of somehow searching for the index of the item that's being dragged, let me just store that index and the parent list's name in the text that's being transferred in the data transfer object in the drag start event. So I'll just go to the drag start event handler. That's the event handler. And instead of setting just this text, I'll set let the name part equals the text of the list item. Let the parent ID equal, that's the parent list ID. That'll be UL first names or UL last names. I want the ID of the containing list, and I want the index of the item that's, this method in jQuery gives you the index of the item that's being dragged. And I'll stuff all of these parts in the text that I'm actually sending to this event. This text. And this text will be, I can do it anywhere I like. I can define my own format. Let's start with the parent's ID, which will be parent ID. I can make an interpolated string here and say parent ID. Then I can separate it with a pipe or any other symbol I like. and then I'll separate it with the index. I'll follow it with the index. I'll separate it that. I'll follow that with the pipe, and then lastly the name part, which is John or Mary or Smith or whatever. And similarly, when I get the item from here, when I get the text from here, obviously this text which I get, this existing text, this name part will not be this text. This text will actually just be text, and then I need to get the different parts from here. So I'll separate this, I'll split this on the basis of a pipe, and I'll say let text parts be equals this, and I'll say let the name part, the first one was the parent ID, text parts 0th one is the parent's ID, let the index be the text parts first one, and then the actual text, which is the name part, will be the text parts second thing. And okay, then we already have the name part, and what we're doing here doesn't need any changes. And then finally I just need to remove an element that is an li inside this parent ID. So I'll say, in fact I'll say this £, then the parent ID, that'll be the selector, or yeah, get me all the LIs inside this list. Out of those, get the one that has this index, and please remove that. That's all. Let's run this. That's the move example. If I move John, John goes away. Wow. Okay. Nice. I hope you learned something. Once again, if you have a friend, a relative, someone who wants to become a computer programmer, switch his career, become a software developer for a living, and doesn't know anything about anything, of course, they need to have some basic computer skills. They need to have used Excel and internet and everything. Or if there's someone who, you yourself, if you know programming but can't quite get it yet because you're new, or you studied programming but you don't know how it works in the industry, and you want to make a career switch, then I've got a course starting for you. It's an online course. Go to my website, join my mailing list, and I'll send you an email as soon as the details are announced.